In the sun-baked hills of Texas, where duty and honor still mean something, the deadliest cartel in Mexico is about to learn a brutal lesson about underestimating old warriors. Frank Mitchell's weathered hands have worked this farm for 50 years, but before that, they ended lives in places that don't exist on any map. At 90 years old, he's the last surviving member of the most decorated Black Ops team in CIA history. His codename was Reaper because when he came for you, death was already too late. The cartel thinks they're squeezing out a helpless old man. They don't know that his arthritis-curved fingers once orchestrated operations that toppled governments. They don't know that his failing eyesight once guided impossible shots across jungle valleys. They don't know that when he reaches for his phone to make one last call, he's not begging for help. He's assembling the most lethal reunion in special operations history. This isn't a story about age versus youth. This is about how the most brutal cartel in North America learned that some skills don't fade, some bonds never break, and some old men are best left alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold as Frank Mitchell walked his fence line, his German Shepherd Rex padding faithfully beside him. At 90, he still moved with a deliberate grace that belied his age, each step measured and purposeful. His gnarled hands, spotted with age but steady as granite, gripped a worn walking stick that had seen as many sunrises as he had in the past decade. The farm had been his sanctuary for 50 years, a place where the echoes of his past could fade into the rhythm of seasons and soil. 200 acres of cotton and corn stretched out before him, rows as straight as rifle sights. Frank allowed himself a small smile at that thought. Some habits of precision never quite fade. "Another beautiful morning, Rex," he murmured, pausing, to survey his land. The dog's ears perked up, alert to something beyond the fence line. Frank noticed, too, tire tracks in the soft earth, fresh ones that didn't belong to any local trucks he recognized. His mind, sharp as ever, catalogued the details automatically. Heavy vehicle, military-grade tires, recent within the last 6 hours. Inside his farmhouse, coffee brewed in an ancient percolator while Frank reviewed his morning paper. His eyes, though dimmed by age, caught every detail of the local news. 3 farms sold in the past month, all to the same development company. The Hendersons, who'd worked their land for 3 generations, gone overnight. The Martinez place, empty after 30 years. Sarah, his granddaughter, arrived as she did every morning, her beat-up pickup kicking up dust on the long drive. At 28, she was the image of her grandmother, with the same fierce independence that had first caught Frank's eye 6 decades ago. "Morning, Grandpa," she called out, carrying groceries toward the house. "Mrs. Thompson at the store said we had some visitors in town, men in nice suits asking questions about local properties." Frank nodded, watching a black SUV pass slowly on the county road. "3rd time this week," he noted quietly. "Always around the same time, always the same route." The observation was automatic, decades of training turning simple facts into tactical intelligence. Sarah caught the shift in his tone. She'd grown up on his stories, the carefully edited versions that skipped the classified parts, the blood, the moments when duty demanded terrible choices. "You're worried," she said, not a question. "Just observant," Frank replied, but his eyes never left the road where the SUV had passed. "Might want to ask around town, see if anyone else has had similar visitors." The morning routine continued, checking irrigation lines, inspecting crops, maintaining equipment that was older than Sarah, but kept running through Frank's meticulous care. Every tool had its place in his workshop, organized with military precision. Behind the pegboard, hidden from casual view, was a safe he hadn't opened in years. Lucy, his closest neighbor at a quarter-mile down the road, stopped by with her usual Thursday morning pie. At 75, she was the youngest of the old guard, the families who'd worked this land since before the war. "Frank," she said, her usual warmth tempered by concern. "Heard anything about these development offers? Tom Reagan sold yesterday. Twice market value, cash deal." Frank's weathered face revealed nothing, but his mind was already connecting dots. Reagan's farm controlled the main road into the valley. The Henderson place overlooked the county highway. The Martinez land backed up to the railroad line. "Strategic positions," his old training whispered. "Market's changing," he said carefully, accepting the pie. "Seems like a lot of interest in our quiet little valley lately." Lucy lowered her voice. "Sheriff Thompson says some of these buyers, they've got connections south of the border, not the kind you want to say no to." Frank thanked her for the pie and the information, his mind already gaming out scenarios. By sunset, he'd mapped every recent sale in his head, noting patterns that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't spent decades analyzing territory control patterns in hostile regions. That night, as crickets serenaded the Texas dark, Frank sat on his porch with Rex at his feet. The dog's ears twitched at every sound, but Frank's attention was on the distant headlights moving along back roads where local traffic rarely ventured. His fingers, aching with arthritis but still steady, traced the worn edges of a card in his pocket, a phone number memorized decades ago, never used but never forgotten. "Not yet," he murmured to himself, watching another set of unfamiliar headlights pass. "But soon." Sarah's evening call came right on schedule. "Grandpa, people in town are talking. More farms sold today. The Wilsons, the Carpenters, all to the same company. Nobody's even seen the paperwork. Just cash offers too good to refuse." "Keep your eyes open," Frank advised, his voice carrying decades of command experience without even trying. "Notice anything unusual. Anyone watching places they shouldn't. Might be time to dust off those shooting lessons I gave you." After hanging up, Frank watched the night deepen over his land. To most eyes, it was just another Texas farm, valuable only for its acreage and location, but Frank saw what others didn't. Defensive positions, clear fields of fire, natural choke points. He'd chosen this land carefully, half a century ago, when he'd needed a place where ghosts from his past couldn't find him. Now, as he felt the night wind shift and caught the distant sound of vehicles moving without lights, he wondered if perhaps he'd chosen too well. Some people, it seemed, were about to learn the hard way that this old farmer knew far more about territory control than growing cotton. Rex growled softly at his feet, sensing his master's tension. Frank patted the dog's head, his other hand, unconsciously moving to his walking stick in a grip that spoke of weapons training rather than age. "Not yet, boy," he whispered, "but soon." The old shoebox hadn't seen daylight in 15 years. Frank pulled it from beneath his bed with hands that trembled, not from age, but from the weight of memories it contained. Inside, beneath a faded photograph of 6 young men in unmarked uniforms, lay his past. 1955, Laos, he murmured to Rex, who watched with curious eyes. "Back when the world didn't know we were there." His fingers traced the faces in the photo. Murphy, Reynolds, Jackson, Cooper, Martinez. Each name carried the weight of shared secrets, of missions that would never see declassification. All gone now, just me left. The morning paper lay beside him, its headlines screaming about drug violence near the border. Frank's mind drifted to another jungle, another time. They'd been tracking a weapons shipment through terrain so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. Murphy had spotted the ambush first. He always did. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. They never found bodies. They were that good. A truck's rumble snapped him back to present. Through his bedroom window, he watched another black SUV crawl past his property, this one moving slower than the others. The occupants weren't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. Sarah arrived early, her face tight with worry. "Grandpa, there's something you need to see." She spread printouts across his kitchen table, property records, sales documents, corporate filings. I work at the county clerk's office, remember? All these new property purchases, they trace back to shell companies, but I dug deeper. She pointed to a series of transactions. These signatures, these patterns, I recognize them from my law. Enforcement bulletins, it's cartel money. Frank nodded, unsurprised. He'd seen similar patterns before, in countries where criminal enterprises needed legitimate fronts. You've done good work, Sarah. Your grandmother would be proud. She had the same eye for details. There's more, Sarah continued. They're buying specific properties, creating a corridor from the border straight through our valley. And your farm, she paused, swallowing hard. It's right in the middle of their path. Frank stood, moving to his gun cabinet. Inside, his old hunting rifle gleamed with the care of regular maintenance. Behind it, hidden in the wooden frame, was a compartment he hadn't opened since buying the farm. Some preparations you make, hoping never to need them. Did I ever tell you about Operation Starfall? He asked suddenly, surprising Sarah with the change of subject. 1962, during the Cuban crisis, my team had orders to infiltrate and disable a series of radar installations. Intelligence said each site had 30 guards. They were wrong. There were 100. 6 of us against 100. Sarah leaned forward. Grandpa rarely talked about his service, and never in detail. What happened? We completed the mission. No losses. Frank's voice carried no pride, just statement of fact. Because we weren't. 6 men fighting 100. We were 6 men who knew how to make 100 fight themselves. As if on cue, another SUV passed the farm. This time, Frank caught a glimpse of the driver. Young, military bearing, cartel tattoo partially visible. On his neck. Professional but obvious to trained eyes. They'll come soon, Frank said, watching the vehicle disappear around the bend. They always start the same way. Friendly business offer first, then pressure, then threats. Sarah's hand found her grandfather's, squeezing gently. We should call the police. Frank shook his head. Sheriff Thompson's a good man, but he's out of his depth. This needs, he paused, choosing his words carefully, a different approach. That afternoon, Frank walked his property with new purpose. Where others saw grazing land, he saw kill zones. The old barn's position suddenly seemed less about convenience and more about covering approaches. The irrigation ditches he dug decades ago formed perfect defensive channels. Your grandfather's getting paranoid, he heard one neighbor tell Sarah at the feed store. But Sarah had seen the photos, heard the stories. She knew better. That night, as darkness claimed the Texas sky, Frank sat at his kitchen table cleaning his hunting rifle. The familiar motions brought back memories of other weapons, other nights, preparing for missions that officially never happened. In the distance, more headlights moved along back roads, 3 sets now, coordinated movements. Sarah called just before midnight, her voice tense. Grandpa, the Hendersons, they didn't sell willingly. Tom Henderson just came into the emergency room. Fell down his stairs the night before the sale. Frank's hand tightened on the phone. Some tactics never change, no matter the decade or continent. Sarah, remember that summer I taught you to shoot? Every Sunday after church, from when I was 12. Good, time to practice again. He paused, making a decision. And tomorrow bring your laptop. Show me everything you've found on these property sales, every detail. After hanging up, Frank returned to the shoebox. Beneath the photo lay a small black notebook, its pages filled with numbers and names in a code only 6 men had ever known. 5 were dead. But the contacts, arms dealers, intelligence officers, specialists in certain necessary dark skills, some might still be active. Rex growled softly at the window. Outside, a car had stopped at the end of his drive, just sitting there with lights off. Frank didn't bother looking. Let them watch. Let them think they were dealing with a helpless old man. His fingers traced one particular number in the notebook. He'd memorized it decades ago, sworn only to use it if the situation was dire enough. The last time this number had been called, a government had fallen. Not yet, he whispered to Rex. But soon. Very soon. In the dark, Frank Mitchell smiled. Not the warm smile of a grandfather, but the cold expression of a man who had once made nations tremble. Age might have slowed his steps, but it hadn't dulled the mind that had orchestrated some of the deadliest covert operations of the Cold War. The cartel was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between old and obsolete. The Mercedes SUVs arrived at precisely 10 a.m., their black paint gleaming under the Texas sun. Frank counted 4 vehicles, noting their tactical positioning. 1 blocking his drive, 2 flanking, 1 hanging back as a tactical reserve. Professional, military training. These weren't ordinary cartel thugs. Rex stood silent beside Frank's chair on the porch, hackles raised but making no sound. Frank had trained him well. They watched together as 8 men emerged from the vehicles, their expensive suits not quite hiding their combat training. The leader, a tall man with silver hair and cartel commander's bearing, approached the porch with practiced confidence. "Mr. Mitchell," the man smiled, his accent cultured, educated. "I'm Miguel Vargas. I represent certain investment interests in your region." He extended his hand. Frank didn't take it. "Most investors don't need armed escorts," Frank observed mildly, noting the bulges of concealed weapons under expensive jackets. His comment caught Vargas off guard. Most elderly farmers wouldn't spot such details. Vargas recovered smoothly. "Dangerous times, Mr. Mitchell. One must take precautions." His eyes swept the farm with professional assessment. "I must say, your property is uniquely positioned. My employers are prepared to make a very generous offer." Frank rocked slowly in his chair, every bit the aging farmer, but his eyes, sharp as ever, caught every detail. 2 men moving toward his barn, one by the vehicle's hand near his weapon, another speaking quietly into a radio. Standard cartel takeover protocol. He'd seen it before, in other countries, other decades. "Not interested in selling," Frank said simply. "Family land." Vargas's smile tightened. "Mr. Mitchell, perhaps you don't understand the opportunity here. We're prepared to offer 3 times market value. Cash, of course. More than generous for a farm in your condition." His eyes pointedly noted the aging equipment, the weathered barn. "Heard about the Hendersons," Frank replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Vargas pause. "Nasty fall just before they sold. Mighty convenient timing." The pretense of friendliness faded from Vargas's eyes. "Accidents happen, Mr. Mitchell, especially to those who don't recognize good opportunities. At your age, stairs can be particularly treacherous." Sarah's truck appeared at the end of the drive. Her timing, perfect as always. Frank had taught her well. Arrive during, not after, never let them catch you alone. She parked behind the cartel vehicles, effectively blocking their exit. A small tactical advantage, one that didn't go unnoticed by Vargas's men. "Morning, Grandpa," she called out cheerfully, carrying grocery bags as if nothing was amiss. But Frank noted her careful positioning, the way she kept the truck between herself and the armed men. "Hope I'm not interrupting a business meeting." "Just finishing up," Frank said. Then to Vargas, his voice carrying decades of command authority, "My answer's no. Best leave while you can." Vargas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't think you understand. This valley, your farm, they're very important to certain people. People who don't take no for an answer. We're trying to be civilized here, but you'll resort to uncivilized methods if necessary," Frank finished. "Like with the Hendersons, the Wilsons, the Martinez family." Each name landed like a bullet, making Vargas's eyes narrow. "Yes, I know about them. Know about your shell companies, too. Know a lot of things, Mr. Vargas." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Vargas's face. This wasn't going according to script. Old farmers weren't supposed to know about shell companies or spot-concealed weapons. They weren't supposed to recognize tactical formations or understand cartel protocols. "You have 24 hours to reconsider," Vargas said finally. "After that, we cannot guarantee your safety, or your granddaughter's," Rex growled, a low, dangerous sound. Frank's hand touched the dog's head, calming him with practiced ease. "That sounded like a threat, Mr. Vargas. Simply stating facts. This valley is changing. Progress cannot be stopped. Those who resist progress often suffer unfortunate accidents." Frank stood slowly, arthritis making the motion genuine. But something in his stance made Vargas step back, an unconscious reaction to predator body language that decades of civilization hadn't erased. 24 hours, Vargas repeated, trying to regain control of the situation. "We'll return tomorrow for your answer." As the cartel vehicles departed, Sarah joined Frank on the porch. "They'll be watching the farm now," she said quietly. "They already were," Frank replied, "but now they'll make mistakes, overconfident, aggressive. They think they're hunting an old man." Sarah studied her grandfather's face, seeing not the aging farmer, but hints of the operator he'd once been. "What's the play, Grandpa?" Frank watched the dust settle on the drive, his mind already gaming out scenarios. "Get your laptop, show me everything you found, then we need to check the barn. Time to open some old boxes." Later, as sunset painted the sky crimson, Frank stood in his workshop. The hidden compartment behind the pegboard wasn't just a gun safe, it was an armory, not the weapons. Those would be too risky to keep. But the equipment, the communications gear, the tactical supplies he'd cached decades. Some things you keep just in case. Sarah's research spread across his workbench painted a clear picture. The cartel wasn't just buying land, they were building an infrastructure, supply routes, safe houses, distribution networks, all hidden. Behind legitimate businesses and shell companies, they're getting bold, Sarah noted, pointing to property records. Not even trying to hide the pattern anymore. They think no one's paying attention. Frank smiled grimly. That's their first mistake. He reached for his phone, then paused. "Sarah, if I make this call, things will get complicated. Dangerous." She squared her shoulders, her grandmother's determination shining through. "They threatened our family, Grandpa. Our home. Make the call." Frank nodded, his fingers moving to dial a number he'd memorized half a century ago. Time to remind the cartel that some old soldiers don't fade away. They just wait for the right moment to strike back. The cartel's return didn't wait 24 hours. They came at midnight, 6 black SUVs cutting their lights as they approached the farm. Frank watched through his night vision monocular. Old equipment, still reliable after decades in storage. Rex lay silent beside him, trained to understand the difference between surveillance and threat. "Right on schedule," Frank murmured, counting 15 armed men deploying in textbook cartel intimidation formation. Their night vision gear caught moonlight as they moved. Modern equipment, military grade. They were done playing businessmen. His phone vibrated, Sarah's text. "Police scanner active. 3 accidents reported on roads leading to your farm. All emergency vehicles conveniently detained." Frank's lips tightened. They'd isolated the farm, cut off potential help, professional work. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd given an old tactical operator time to prepare. Vargas's voice carried across the dark farm through a bullhorn. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize for the late hour, but business can't wait. Perhaps we could discuss our offer more productively now." Frank stood on his darkened porch, letting them see his silhouette. "Kind of late for business meetings, Mr. Vargas." "Special circumstances," Vargas replied smoothly. "My employers were disappointed with our conversation earlier. They've authorized me to double our previous offer. 6 times market value. Very generous." Still not interested. Frank's voice carried clearly, decades of command presence cutting through the night. Mr. Mitchell, Vargas's tone hardened. Look around you. 15 of my men, all ex-military. Your local police are occupied. Your granddaughter's apartment is being watched. This isn't a negotiation anymore. It's a courtesy call before things become unpleasant. Frank's hand touched the hidden compartment in his walking stick. A habit. From older, darker days. You seem to think you're dealing with a helpless old man. No, Mr. Mitchell, we know exactly who we're dealing with. Vargas's words carried smug confidence. We did our research after this morning. Frank Mitchell, former CIA operative. Impressive record 40 years ago, but now you're 90 years. Old alone, outgunned and out of options. 2 cartel gunmen had reached the barn, their movements professional but obvious to Frank's experienced eye. 3 more were flanking the house, standard cartel breach preparation. Last chance, Mr. Mitchell. Take the money, sign the papers, walk away with your dignity and your granddaughter's safety intact. Or Vargas let the threat hang. Frank's mind raced through scenarios, decades of tactical experience, calculating odds and options. They'd found his CIA background, but missed the deeper classifications, the blacker operations. Good. Let them think they knew what they were dealing with. You people never learn, Frank said quietly, his voice carrying that deadly calm his old team had learned to recognize. You see an old man, a worn-out farm, an easy target? You should have done better research. Vargas laughed. Better research? We know everything. Your age, your resources, your limitations. We know you can't fight back, can't call for help, can't. The farm's ancient irrigation system suddenly roared to life, powerful jets of water catching 3 cartel gunmen off guard, ruining their night. Vision equipment. Frank had spent the afternoon adjusting pressure valves and angles, turning farming equipment into tactical advantages. You know what you found in official records, Frank corrected as confusion spread through the cartel ranks. But you missed the important parts, like why certain missions in certain countries are still classified, why certain names still carry weight in certain circles. He reached for his phone, fingers moving to dial that memorized number. You're right about one thing, Mr. Vargas. I'm going to make a call, but not to the police, not to the FBI. I'm calling in old debts from darker days. The first number connected. A gruff voice answered immediately. Mitchell? Jesus, it's been decades. Remember Bogota, 68? Frank's words carried clearly, letting Vargas hear. Time to repay that favor. The cartel commander's confidence wavered. Bogota, 1968. An operation so black, even the CIA's records were redacted. He watched the old man make 2 more calls, each brief, each referencing places and dates that existed, only in sealed files and nightmares. You have 1 hour to clear my property, Frank announced into the darkness. After that, some very dangerous people who owe me their lives are going to start arriving, people who've been waiting decades to repay old debts, people who make your cartel look like amateur hour. To emphasize his point, Rex suddenly appeared behind 2 cartel gunmen, his special operations training showing in his silent approach. The men jumped, spinning to face a threat they hadn't heard coming. When they turned back, Frank had vanished. From the porch, he's bluffing, one of Vargas's lieutenants muttered. Has to be. But Vargas wasn't so sure. Something in the old man's voice, the way he moved, the confidence that came not from bravado, but from absolute certainty. Pull back, he ordered suddenly. Regroup and recon. I want everything on Mitchell's history, everything, especially Bogota, 68. As the cartel forces retreated, Frank watched through his monocular. Sarah's text lit up his phone. Police scanner shows roadblocks clearing. They're running scared. What did you do? Called in the old team, Frank replied simply. Time to remind these people why some operations still give governments nightmares. In his tactical gear cache, untouched for decades, a satellite phone began to charge. 5 more calls to make, to 5 more men who'd sworn blood oaths in places that didn't officially exist. The cartel thought they'd found his past in CIA files. They were about to learn about the missions too dark for any official record. Sleep. Well, Mr. Vargas, Frank whispered to the retreating vehicles, tomorrow you learn why some old soldiers are best left alone. Frank sat in his study, the satellite phone glowing with 5 completed calls. Each conversation had been brief, coded in references to operations that had never made any official record. Each had ended the same way. I'll be there. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the old metal box from his safe. Inside, 5 faded photographs, 5 faces that governments had spent millions trying to identify. The ghost team, they'd been called, because you couldn't catch what you couldn't prove existed. Marcus Shadow Cooper, demolitions and infiltration, he murmured to Rex. John Whisper Ramirez, communications and electronic warfare. David Spectre Chen, tactical planning. William Wraith O'Brien, sniper operations. And James Phantom Sullivan, close combat specialist. The dog's ears perked up at the names as if sensing their importance. Frank smiled, remembering how they'd trained Rex's grandfather for operations too classified to discuss. Some skills passed down through generations, both human and canine. Sarah arrived as dawn broke, carrying coffee and concern. Grandpa, something's happening. The cartel's pulling back, not just here but across 3 counties. Local police scanners going crazy, with reports of their properties being abandoned overnight. They're running background checks, Frank replied, sorting through old papers. Trying to figure out who they're really dealing with. Won't find much. Our deepest operations were never recorded. Sarah studied her grandfather's face. Those men you called, who are they really? Frank's eyes grew distant. Officially? They don't exist, never did. But in '65, when a Soviet bioweapons facility needed to disappear without any trace leading back to the US. In '71, when 3 terrorist cells had to be eliminated simultaneously. In '78, when a rogue general's coup needed to fail naturally. He paused, checking his watch. Vargas's men will have accessed my CIA files by now, found my official missions, my commendations, but they're looking in the wrong place. The real operations, the ones that kept the Cold War cold, those were never written down. His secure phone buzzed, a message from Cooper. Wheels down in 3 hours, bringing toys. Another from Ramirez. Electronic perimeter already up. They won't see us coming. Chen's text was typically precise. Tactical analysis complete. Their patterns are predictable. They're really coming, Sarah whispered, reading the messages over his shoulder. Your old team. We made promises, Frank said quietly. Blood oaths in places that didn't officially exist. When one calls, the others come. No questions, no hesitation. A burner phone, one he'd had Sarah by weeks ago, expecting something like this, chirped with a text from one of her contacts at the county clerk's office. Cartel lawyers pulling all historical records on property, asking questions about military, installations, old government facilities. Frank allowed himself a grim smile. They were chasing ghosts, looking for official explanations for his confidence. They wouldn't find any. His team had specialized in operations that governments could never acknowledge, the kind that changed history without leaving fingerprints. We should warn Sheriff Thompson, Sarah suggested. Give him some hint of what's coming. Already done, Frank replied. Called in a marker with his father. The old sheriff remembers '82, when certain problems along the border quietly disappeared. He'll make sure his son stays clear. Outside, the Texas morning blazed hot and bright. To casual observers, nothing had changed. But Frank's trained eye caught the subtle signs. Cartel surveillance pulled back to safer distances, local traffic patterns shifting as word spread that something was happening. His satellite phone vibrated again. O'Brien's message was short, high ground secured, followed by Sullivan's. Perimeter breach teams in position, like old times. They're already here, Sarah realized, looking around. Aren't they? Frank nodded. Started arriving the moment. I called. Old habits die hard. Cooper's been in the area 3 days, just in case. Ramirez had surveillance equipment planted last week. He always was paranoid. But how? Why? Because we knew, Frank said simply. The moment cartel activity increased in the region, they started moving into position, waiting to see if I'd make the call. Some debts can never be repaid, some bonds never break. He stood, moving to the window with a grace that belied his age. Somewhere out there, hidden from any normal observation, 5 of the deadliest covert. Operators in history were preparing to remind the cartel why some legends are best left alone. What happens now? Sarah asked. Frank checked his weapons one last time. Not the hunting rifles on display, but the specialized equipment hidden beneath. Decades of careful preparation. Now? He smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a kindly grandfather. It was the expression that had made third-world dictators wake up screaming. Now we show them why certain operations are still classified, why certain names still make intelligence agencies nervous, and why you never threaten a man who spent 30 years making problems disappear. The sun climbed higher over Texas, promising another scorching day. But for the cartel, a different kind of heat was coming, the kind that left. No evidence, no witnesses, and no official explanation, just the way the ghost team liked it. 4 unmarked vehicles arrived at Frank's farm throughout the day, each taking different routes, each looking perfectly ordinary. A pest control van, a telephone company truck, a local electrician's service vehicle, a delivery truck from a regional supply company. Nothing to draw attention, everything carefully planned. Marcus Cooper came first, his pest control disguise perfect down to the local company logos and work orders. At 78, he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent decades making things disappear without a trace. Been a while, Reaper, he greeted Frank, using the old code name. His eyes swept the property with professional assessment. Place has good bones. Natural choke points, clear fields of fire. You always did think ahead. Ramirez arrived next, telephone company credentials ready for any inspection. His van contained enough surveillance equipment to monitor half the county, all disguised as standard utility gear. Cartels running scared, he reported, setting up in Frank's barn. Intercepted their communications. They're trying to access classified files from the 60s, getting nervous. Chen's arrival looked like a routine electrical inspection, his truck carrying enough tactical gear to supply a small army, all hidden behind legitimate service equipment. Their patrol patterns are sloppy, he noted, spreading satellite maps across Frank's kitchen table. Overconfident, predictable, just like Bogota. O'Brien's delivery truck was last, taking the longest route. To avoid any surveillance, the sniper had chosen his cover well. Local supply companies delivered to farms all the time. High grounds already mapped, he reported. 3 perfect positions overlooking their main approach routes. Like you knew we'd need them someday. Sarah watched them arrive, these legends her grandfather had only hinted at in stories. Men who'd changed history from the shadows, who'd made and broken nations without leaving traces. Now they were here, in her grandfather's kitchen, planning one last operation. Target analysis complete, Chen announced, his laptop displaying cartel movements. They're consolidating forces at 3 locations: main operations center in the old Wilson warehouse, command and control at the abandoned airstrip, backup facility at the ranch they bought last month. Standard cartel protocol, Ramirez added, monitoring communications. But they're nervous, pulling in additional forces, requesting background checks through federal channels, very interested in anything related to Bogota. Let them look, Frank said, studying the tactical display. They won't find anything. Those files were erased before they were ever written. Cooper examined the barn's foundation, already planning. "Remember Cambodia? How we rigged the entire compound without them ever knowing we were there. 3 days, O'Brien recalled from his position by the window. They never saw us coming, never knew what hit them, just like this will be, Sullivan's voice crackled. Over their secure channel, he was already in position, having arrived days earlier. Perimeter teams report cartels establishing observation posts. Amateur work, they're visible from half a mile out. Frank watched his old team fall into familiar patterns. Decades melted away as they worked, each man knowing his role without need for discussion. Cooper surveyed the property, marking points for his specialized equipment. Ramirez established a surveillance net that would catch anything moving within 5 miles. Chen's tactical analysis grew more detailed by the hour. O'Brien vanished to his sniper posts, becoming one with the landscape. "They're good," Sarah observed, watching them work. "Better than good." "Best in history," Frank corrected quietly. 6 men who could do what armies couldn't. We toppled governments, prevented wars, eliminated threats before they made headlines, all without leaving a trace. The team gathered that evening, their preparations well underway. Cooper's traps were laid, invisible but lethal. Ramirez's surveillance network was active, feeding real-time intelligence. Chen's tactical analysis was complete, every contingency planned for. O'Brien had established interlocking fields of fire that made approach impossible. Sullivan's perimeter teams were ready. "Like old times," Cooper said, "cleaning equipment that hadn't seen use in decades. World thinks we're just old men now, retired, harmless." "Their mistake," O'Brien replied from his position. "Getting old doesn't mean getting soft, just means we've had more time to plan." Frank studied his team, these men who'd come running at his call. Age had whitened their hair, lined their faces, but hadn't dulled their skills. If anything, decades of peace had made them more dangerous. They'd had nothing to do but think, plan, and prepare. "Cartels moving," Ramirez reported suddenly. "Large. A convoy headed this way. Looks like Vargas wants another conversation." "Let them come," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of countless classified operations. "Time to remind them why certain missions are still redacted, why certain names still make intelligence agencies nervous." The team moved to their positions, each man knowing exactly what to do. They weren't just old soldiers coming out of retirement. They were legends, preparing to show why their operations had been too classified to record. "Sarah," Frank called as his granddaughter prepared to leave. "Remember what I taught you about monitoring police bands?" She nodded. "Keep them busy elsewhere. Make sure no official response interferes with whatever's about to happen." "Good girl." Frank watched her drive away, then turned to his team. "Gentlemen, let's remind these cartel boys why some old soldiers are best left alone." The Texas sun set on what looked like an ordinary farm, where 6 old men prepared to demonstrate why their missions had been too dangerous to declassify, and why threatening one of their own was about to become the cartel's biggest mistake. Dawn painted the farm in shades of gold as Cooper walked the perimeter, his experienced eyes seeing possibilities in every ordinary feature. The irrigation ditches became tank traps, reinforced with hidden steel plates. Hay bales transformed into concealed firing positions. Even the old grain silo had potential. "Beautiful setup, Frank," he muttered, examining the barn's foundation. "You've been preparing this place for decades, haven't you?" Frank nodded, watching Ramirez install surveillance equipment disguised as ordinary farm sensors. "Started in 75 after Belgrade. Learned some things about defensive positions there." "Belgrade," Cooper chuckled darkly. 3 men against an entire mechanized brigade. They never knew what hit them. O'Brien's voice crackled over their comms from his hidden position. "Movement on the South Road. Cartel convoy. Looks like reconnaissance. 8 vehicles. Heavy weapons. Visible." Let them look, Chen replied from his tactical center in the barn's hidden basement. Everything they see is exactly what we want them to see. The farm's transformation continued with practiced efficiency. Hooper's pest control work concealed sophisticated explosive charges at key points. Ramirez's telephone repairs established a surveillance network that could track a mouse across the county. Every team member knew their role. Every action, precise and purposeful. "Remember Kandahar?" Sullivan asked as he helped Frank modify the farm's irrigation controls. "How we turned their own infrastructure against them." Frank's hands moved surely over the controls, adjusting pressures and timing. Same principle. They'll be looking for military hardware, tactical equipment, won't expect a cornfield to be their biggest problem. Sarah arrived with supplies, her truck loaded with innocent-looking farm equipment. Each piece had been carefully selected, each would serve a deadly purpose when properly modified. She watched in amazement as the old men transformed ordinary tools into tactical advantages. "Grandfather," she said quietly, "the sheriff's asking questions. 3 different agencies have requested satellite coverage of the area." "Let them watch," Chen replied, not looking up from his tactical displays. "By the time they figure it out, it'll be too late to matter." The team worked through the day, their movements carefully choreographed to appear routine to any observation. Cooper's demolitions expertise turned everyday farm features into deadly surprises. O'Brien established multiple sniper positions, each looking like normal farm maintenance. Ramirez's surveillance net grew more sophisticated by the hour. "Cartels pulling in heavy resources," Ramirez reported, monitoring communications. "Hiring ex-military contractors, bringing in specialized equipment. They think they're preparing for a siege." "Let them," Frank said, checking the modified irrigation controls one final time. "They're preparing for the wrong kind of fight." As sunset approached, Chen gathered them for a tactical review. His laptop displayed detailed overlays of the farm, each defensive position marked, each trap and sensor noted. The ordinary-looking farm had become a sophisticated kill zone, with interlocking fields of fire and carefully planned response sectors. "Multiple approach routes, all compromised," he indicated. "Primary attack will likely come from the south, following the main road. Secondary forces will try to flank through the east field, using the tree line for cover. Both routes are prepared." Cooper confirmed. "Primary charges set, secondaries in place. All controllable, all deniable." "Surveillance coverage is complete," Ramirez added. "Full spectrum monitoring, encrypted channels only. They won't see or hear anything we don't want them to." O'Brien's voice came through their comms, professional and cold. "Long-range positions established. 360 coverage. No blind spots. Even tried approaching my own positions. Couldn't do it without being seen." Sullivan emerged from his perimeter check, his movement so quiet even Rex barely noticed him. "Outer security is active. Motion sensors disguised as normal farm equipment. Anyone tries to sneak in will know." Frank studied the tactical display, noting how his decades of subtle preparation had created perfect killing grounds. Every fence line provided cover fire angles. Every ditch could become a death trap. Even the crops were planted to channel movement into prepared zones. "They're thinking like military," Chen observed. "Expecting a defensive position, hardened targets, obvious strong points. Won't be looking for this," Cooper grinned, holding up what appeared to be ordinary irrigation pipe. "Whole place is rigged. Touch the wrong fence, step in the wrong spot." Sarah watched them work, these legendary operators who turned her grandfather's farm into a sophisticated tactical position. "How long have you all been planning this?" "Since '73, Sullivan answered. "After Venezuela, Frank said someday we'd need a place where we could control every aspect of the battlefield. Been adding pieces ever since, every visit, every holiday." As night fell, the team made final adjustments. Cooper's traps were armed, Ramirez's sensors active, O'Brien's firing positions prepared. The farm looked exactly the same to outside observers, but had become one of the most sophisticated tactical positions ever created. Remember what you taught. Me about irrigation schedules? Frank asked Sarah. Time to put that knowledge to use. When the shooting starts, you'll control water pressure to every sector, turn the fields into swamps, dry ground into mud pits. His granddaughter nodded, understanding now why he'd insisted she learn every aspect of the farm's operations. She wasn't just a farmer's granddaughter, she was part of their tactical plan. "They're coming," Ramirez announced, checking his monitors. "Large convoy assembling at their command center. Looks like Vargas is done playing games." "Good," Frank replied, watching darkness claim his farm. In the night, even Rex's doghouse had become a concealed fighting position. Let them come. Time they learned why some missions are still classified, why some operators are best left in retirement. The team moved to their positions, each man knowing this might be their last operation. But if it was to be their final mission, they would remind the world why their names had once made nations tremble. "Like old times," Cooper said quietly, checking his detonators one last time. "Better," Frank replied. "This time we chose the battlefield, and we've had 50 years to prepare it." Sheriff Thompson pulled up to Frank's farm just after sunrise, alone and unannounced. He parked well back from the house, hands visible on the steering wheel. Smart man, Frank thought. The sheriff's father had taught him well. "Morning, Frank," Thompson called out, staying by his vehicle. "Mind if we talk?" Frank watched O'Brien's scope tracking the sheriff from a hidden position, saw Cooper's finger ease off a detonator. "Coffee's hot," he replied, signaling all clear to his team. Inside the kitchen, Thompson studied his cup, choosing words carefully. "Got 3-letter agencies calling my office, satellite coverage requests, unusual movement patterns. And suddenly, every cartel operation in the county is pulling back, consolidating." "Sounds complicated," Frank offered mildly. "Dad told me about 82, Thompson continued. "Never gave details, just said if I ever saw certain patterns, I should talk to you first before making official moves." Ramirez's voice crackled in Frank's earpiece. "He's clean, no surveillance, no wires, came alone like he said." "What exactly did your father tell you?" Frank asked. "Said there are some old soldiers you don't interfere with, some operations you don't want to know about. Said if I ever saw the cartel running scared for no apparent reason, I should remember what happened along the border in 82. Frank nodded. Slowly, the old sheriff had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. "Your father's a wise man. So, I'm asking, officially and unofficially, do I need to be concerned about what's about to happen?" "Only if you're on the wrong side," Frank replied. "Keep your deputies clear of my farm for the next few days. Any gunfire, explosions, or disturbances get logged as training exercises. Papers are already filed." Thompson absorbed this. "And the Cartel won't be your problem much longer." The sheriff stood, understanding the dismissal. "I'll make sure the state police understand this is a local matter. Handle the feds if they come sniffing, just..." He paused at the door. "Keep the collateral damage minimal." "Always do," Frank assured him. "That's why some missions never made the papers." After Thompson left, Sarah arrived with more news. Local. Farmers are talking. They've seen the cartel pulling back, consolidating. They're offering to help. "How so?" Chen asked, looking up from his tactical displays. "Equipment breakdowns blocking key roads, controlled burns creating smoke cover, irrigation accidents flooding strategic areas. Nothing obvious, nothing coordinated, just farmers helping farmers." Frank smiled. The community was coming together, not as combatants but as supporters. Every delayed cartel vehicle, every obscured line of sight, every blocked access point would add to their advantage. "Like Malaysia," Sullivan commented over. "Comms, local population providing passive support without direct involvement. Beautiful." The team had spent decades practicing invisible warfare. Now they were teaching an entire community to resist without appearing to fight. Lucy, Frank's elderly neighbor, brought her usual pie and intelligence about cartel movements she'd observed from her hilltop home. The local feed store owner reported unusual fuel purchases that helped track vehicle operations. Even the high school kids helped, their social media posts unwittingly providing surveillance coverage of the entire county. Vargas is getting desperate, Ramirez reported, monitoring communications. His bosses want results. 3 shipments delayed. Distribution. Network stalled. He's promising to end this tomorrow. Good, Cooper replied, finishing his final preparations. Let him come in angry. Angry men make mistakes. Chen's tactical display showed the growing web of local support. Roads that mysteriously needed repair, fields that required emergency irrigation, power lines that suddenly required maintenance. Each seemingly innocent activity contributed to their strategic advantage. Remember Laos? O'Brien asked from his sniper's nest. How the whole village helped without ever picking up a weapon. Same principle, Frank agreed. Best defense is the one your enemy never sees coming. Sarah coordinated the civilian support network from the local diner, making it look like nothing more than coffee shop gossip. But each casual conversation carried tactical information. Each friendly wave conveyed strategic updates. Cartels watching the wrong things, Sullivan observed. Looking for military movement, suspicious activity, missing the real threat. Ordinary people doing ordinary things that just happened to work against them. As evening approached, Frank gathered his team for final preparations. The locals had done their part, creating a passive defense network that would funnel the cartel exactly where they wanted them. Now it was time for the active phase. They'll come at dawn, Chen predicted, studying movement patterns. 3-pronged attack, trying to overwhelm us with numbers and firepower. Let them come, Frank said quietly. The community's given us every advantage we need. Time to show the cartel why some old soldiers are best left in retirement. The team dispersed to their positions, each understanding that tomorrow would remind the world why their missions had required such high classification. The cartel was about to learn that the deadliest weapons aren't guns or bombs, but old men who've spent decades preparing for one last fight. Like Singapore, Cooper mused, checking his equipment one final time. Better, Frank corrected. This time we've got an entire community helping without even knowing the full plan. Tomorrow, Vargas learns why some victories are classified too secret to record. Midnight brought the first probe of the farm's defenses. 3 cartel vehicles, running dark, tried to approach through the east field. They made it exactly 50 yards before Cooper's modified irrigation system turned solid ground into a swamp, trapping their wheels in suddenly liquefied soil. Amateur hour, O'Brien commented from his hidden position, watching through thermal optics. They're testing our perimeter, but don't know what to look for. The trapped vehicle's radio traffic crackled through Ramirez's surveillance net. Something's wrong with the ground. Can't get traction, need recovery vehicles. Let them spin their wheels, Frank instructed. Don't engage yet. Sarah's text arrived moments later. Police scanner shows cartel pulling in heavy equipment from 3 counties. They're mobilizing everything they have. The team watched as the cartel's frustration mounted. Every probe met invisible resistance. Every reconnaissance effort encountered mysterious obstacles. Their sophisticated equipment reported nothing. Unusual, yet nothing worked as it should. Vargas is calling in specialists, Ramirez reported, monitoring their communications. Ex-military consultants, demolitions experts, electronic warfare units. He's throwing money at the problem. Chen studied his tactical displays, noting enemy movements. They're setting up for a major push. 3 staging areas, heavy weapons being moved into position. Professional work, finally. Dawn brought new pressure. Cartel helicopters appeared, conducting aerial surveillance. They found nothing suspicious, just an old farm with some aging equipment. Every piece of tactical gear was perfectly concealed, every defensive position invisible from above. Remember Tehran? Sullivan asked over the secure channel. How we hid an entire operation in plain sight. Same principle, Frank replied, watching the helicopters through his disguised observation post. They're looking so hard for something suspicious, they're missing what's right in front of them. The morning satellite pass revealed another layer of cartel preparation. 3 separate mercenary units had arrived, their vehicles parked at the abandoned airstrip. These weren't ordinary criminals, they were professional soldiers for hire. Getting expensive for them, Cooper noted, checking his detonators. Those units charge premium rates. Vargas must be desperate. Sarah's morning intelligence briefing confirmed it. The cartel's regional operations were paralyzed, their distribution network frozen. 3 weeks of product hadn't moved. Millions. In losses mounting, their bosses were demanding action. Intercepted orders from cartel leadership, Ramirez announced. Vargas has 24 hours to resolve this situation, or they're sending in their own team to replace him. Frank watched another cartel convoy pass on the distant highway, more heavy equipment heading to their staging areas. They're abandoning subtlety, going for overwhelming force. The pressure built through the day. Cartel forces established observation posts on every high point surrounding the farm. Their electronic warfare units swept for communications, finding nothing because Ramirez's system operated on principles they couldn't detect. "This is different," one mercenary commander reported to Vargas, his frustration clear on intercepted channels. "We're not dealing with amateurs. Everything's wrong, but nothing shows up on sensors. It's like fighting ghosts." "Ghosts," Cooper chuckled, remembering old missions. If they only knew. By afternoon, the cartel's preparation had reached new levels. Satellite imagery showed over 50 vehicles assembled. Heavy weapons, professional troops, enough firepower to take a small city, all focused on one old farm. "They're getting ready for a major assault," Chen reported, studying drone footage. "Multiple attack vectors, coordinated air support, electronic warfare coverage. Someone there knows what they're doing." "Good," Frank replied calmly. "Professionals will understand what happens next. Might even survive because of it." The team watched their enemies mass, each man focused on his role in what was coming. They'd spent decades preparing for this, turning an ordinary farm into a masterpiece of tactical engineering. Every cartel preparation played into their hands. Every professional assessment missed the true nature of what they faced. "Vargas is addressing his troops," Ramirez reported, monitoring their frequencies. "Promising them this ends tonight. Telling them they face a handful of old men trying to play soldier. Let them think that," Frank said quietly, watching night fall over his farm. "By morning, they'll understand why some missions never made the official records, why some operators were too dangerous to acknowledge." The pressure had built to breaking point. On one side, a massive cartel force bristling with modern weapons and professional soldiers. On the other, 6 old men who'd spent 50 years preparing for one last operation. Tomorrow would remind the world why some victories had to be classified, why some soldiers were best left in retirement, and why threatening one of their own was about to become the cartel's most expensive mistake. The cartel made their first serious move at midnight. 3 elite teams, ex-military professionals, attempted to infiltrate the farm's perimeter. Their night vision gear was top of the line, their movement disciplined, their approach textbook. Perfect. They never stood a chance. "Team 1 crossing the east field," O'Brien reported calmly from his hidden position. "Walking right into grid 7. Frank watched through thermal optics as the first team hit Cooper's modified irrigation trap. Suddenly, high-pressure jets transformed the solid ground into a morass, their footing gone in seconds. As they struggled, invisible sensors tracked their every movement, like shooting fish in a barrel, Cooper muttered. But Frank held up his hand. No lethal force yet, just education. The second team made it farther, using the tree line for cover. They were good, moving in perfect tactical formation, covering each other's advance. But Sullivan was better. He'd spent 3 days preparing this exact scenario. "Remember Manila?" Sullivan's voice whispered over comms. "How we turned their own movement against them." The tree line erupted with sound. Recordings of farm equipment, carefully positioned to mask the team's approach while actually revealing their position. Each step they took triggered another layer of deception. "Third team approaching the barn," Ramirez reported. "These guys are different. Russian private military contractors by their radio discipline. Show them why we were the best," Frank ordered. The Russian team's sophisticated electronics suddenly failed, not obviously but subtly. Their communications degraded. Their tactical displays showed phantom signals. Every piece of intelligence they gathered was perfectly wrong. "Contact front," one Russian operator shouted, spinning to face a threat that wasn't there. His team responded instantly, demonstrating their training. But they were shooting at shadows, fighting an enemy that didn't exist. "Now they're starting to understand," Chen observed from his tactical center. "Look at their movement. They're second-guessing everything." The night erupted in chaos, but it was controlled chaos. Every cartel team found themselves engaged not by direct force, but by the farm itself. Ground that should have been solid wasn't. Approaches that looked clear weren't. Equipment that should have worked didn't. "Vargas is pulling them back," Ramirez announced, monitoring their communications. "They're regrouping, trying to figure out what just happened." The team watched through various sensors as the elite cartel units retreated. Not a single shot had been fired, yet they'd been thoroughly defeated. Their communications told the story. "Something's wrong here. This isn't normal. Who are we dealing with?" Drank allowed himself a small smile. "Now for Phase 2. Right on cue, Sarah's network activated. Police bands erupted with reports of suspicious activities near cartel staging areas. Local farmers reported equipment breakdowns blocking access. Roads. Power companies suddenly needed to conduct emergency maintenance on lines, leading to cartel positions. "They're getting nervous," O'Brien reported, watching through his scope as cartel commanders argued at their command post. "Professional soldiers don't like enemies they can't fight." Vargas's voice crackled over their monitored frequencies, rage evident in his tone. "I don't care what it costs. Get me someone who can explain what we're dealing with." "Should have done better research," Cooper chuckled, checking his sensors. "Some things don't show up in any database." The night wore on. 2 more probing attacks met the same fate. Each time the cartel forces found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't engage, couldn't understand. Their frustration mounted with every failure. "Dawn's coming," Sullivan reported. "They're pulling back to their staging areas. Looks like they're planning something bigger." Frank studied the tactical display, noting how each failed attack had revealed more of the cartel's capabilities while exposing none of their own. "They'll come in force next time. No more probing attacks." "Good," Chen replied, updating his analyses. "The more forces they commit, the more they expose themselves." Sarah's morning update confirmed their success. The cartel's careful planning was unraveling. Their sophisticated operational security had been compromised by the need to rush in reinforcements. Local eyes reported convoy after convoy arriving. They were committing everything to this fight. "Just like Paraguay," O'Brien mused. "Remember how they kept escalating, never realizing each escalation worked in our favor." Frank watched the sun rise over his farm, everything appearing normal despite the night's activities. Not a shell casing on the ground, not a track in the dirt, nothing. To show what had happened, just the way he'd planned it. "They'll come soon," he told his team. "Everything they have, everything they can bring, and when they do..." "They learn why some missions never made the official record," Cooper finished. "Why some operators were too dangerous to acknowledge. The cartel had drawn first blood, but found themselves bleeding instead. Now they would respond with overwhelming force, never realizing they were playing directly into the hands of men who'd spent 50 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Like the old days, Sullivan said quietly. Better, Frank corrected. In the old days, we had to improvise. This time, we've had half a century to prepare the perfect trap. The warning came from Sarah, her voice tight with controlled panic over their secure line. "Grandpa, we have a problem, a big one." Frank listened as his granddaughter laid out a discovery that changed everything. While monitoring county records, she'd found something impossible. Tactical details about the farm's defense system in files that shouldn't exist. "Someone's been documenting everything," she reported. "Ground sensors, firing positions, even Cooper's irrigation traps. It's all there, buried in routine agricultural surveys." The team gathered in Frank's kitchen, tension thick in the air. Chen's laptop displayed the compromised data, years of their careful preparations, mapped out in precise detail. "Had to be someone local," Cooper said, studying the files. "Someone who had access, who knew what to look for." "Someone who's been watching us for years," Sullivan added grimly. "Learning our methods, our habits." Ramirez's surveillance network suddenly pinged. "Multiple cartel units moving. They're using approach routes we didn't cover, paths that aren't in any official record." Frank's mind raced through possibilities. Decades of counterintelligence, experience analyzing patterns. "When did the documentation start?" Sarah checked the files. "First entries, 15 years ago, right after Maria Thompson became county surveyor," Frank finished quietly. "Sheriff Thompson's sister, the woman who'd mapped every farm in the valley for 20 years. "Impossible," O'Brien argued from his position. "Maria's family has been here for generations. They're pillars of the community." "Perfect cover," Chen countered, pulling up more data. "Look at her travel records, regular trips to Mexico City, always coinciding with cartel banking activity. She's their long-term asset." The revelation hit hard. Maria had been at every community event, every town meeting. She'd surveyed the farm multiple times, each visit seemingly routine. And every time, she'd been mapping their defenses, documenting their preparations. "She's good," Frank admitted, remembering how she'd always asked such detailed questions about his irrigation systems, his property improvements. "Very good." "Cartel's changing formation," Ramirez reported urgently. "They're adapting to our defensive layout, using her intelligence to bypass our primary positions." Frank's mind shifted to tactical mode. Maria's betrayal hurt, but he'd learned long ago to turn emotional blows into strategic advantages. "Chen, how much does she actually know?" The tactical officer smiled slowly, understanding. "She documented what she could see, what we let her." "See?" "Exactly," Frank nodded. "She mapped our defenses, the obvious ones, the ones we wanted people to find." Understanding dawned on the team's faces. For 50 years, they hadn't just been preparing defenses, they'd been preparing multiple layers of deception. What Maria had documented was just the surface, the defensive plan they'd allowed to be visible. "Like Moscow," Cooper grinned. "Remember how we let them find the first layer of security? Made them think they'd compromised everything, then hit them with the real system when they thought they were safe," O'Brien finished. "Beautiful." Sarah arrived at the farm, bringing more detailed records. "Maria's accessing the files now, sending everything to the cartel. They're completely restructuring their assault based on her intelligence." "Perfect," Frank said quietly. "Let them think they've found our playbook. Meanwhile, Sullivan's voice carried dark amusement, "they're walking into the real trap, the one we never let anyone see." The team moved with renewed purpose, adjusting to the new situation. Cooper activated secondary systems that had laid dormant for decades. Ramirez shifted to backup communications protocols. Chen updated tactical displays to show the true defensive layout. "Cartel's moving support units into what they think are our blind spots," O'Brien reported. "Positioning artillery where Maria's maps show gaps in our coverage." They think they found our weakness, Frank observed, watching enemy units move exactly where he'd always intended them to go. Think they've uncovered our secrets. Should we warn the sheriff about his sister? Sarah asked. Frank shook his head. Not yet. Her intelligence is about to lead the cartel into a very expensive mistake. After that, then we'll deal with the infiltrator. The team watched as cartel forces continued repositioning every move. Based on Maria's carefully documented intelligence, they thought they'd found the key to breaking the farm's defenses. Instead, they were about to learn why some operators were too dangerous to infiltrate. Almost feels unfair, Cooper mused, watching the enemy units move into perfectly prepared kill zones. They wanted to play spy games, Frank replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of covert operations. Now they'll learn why our missions were too classified to record, why some secrets are best left undiscovered. The sun climbed higher, over the Texas farm, illuminating what looked like vulnerable approaches and defensive gaps. But beneath that carefully crafted illusion lay the real defense system, one that had never been documented, never been mapped, and was about to remind the cartel why some old soldiers are best left alone. Frank gathered his team in the barn's hidden command center, where Chen's tactical displays showed the cartel forces repositioning based on Maria's intelligence. Every move they made followed her documented weaknesses in the farm's defenses perfectly. They don't think they've found our blueprint, Frank began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had once guided nations into chaos. Time to show them why some plans are meant to be discovered. Cooper spread out his real demolitions map, showing charges and triggers that had never been documented. Remember Cambodia? How we let them find the obvious explosives? Then hit. End them with the ones they never knew to look for. Sullivan finished, studying the display. But this is better. We've had years to layer the deceptions. Ramirez's surveillance feeds showed cartel teams moving heavy weapons into what they thought were blind spots in the farm's coverage. Each position had been carefully noted in Maria's surveys, each one appearing perfect for attacking the documented. Defenses, they're deploying exactly as predicted, Chen reported, updating tactical overlays, moving their best units into what they think are our weakest sectors. Vargas is confident, Ramirez added, monitoring communications. Telling his bosses he's found our vulnerability, requesting permission to launch full assault. Frank watched the enemy movements with practiced eyes. Every cartel unit was positioning itself precisely where his team had spent decades preparing for them to be. The infiltrators' intelligence was about to become their deadliest weapon. Sarah, he called over secure comms. Time to activate the community network, but with a twist. His granddaughter understood immediately. The local farmers who'd been helping defend the valley would now become their greatest deception. Each piece of equipment blocking a road, each field deliberately flooded, each accidental obstacle would drive the cartel forces further into the real trap. Like Venezuela, O'Brien commented from his hidden position, using their own intelligence against them, making them think they're being clever while walking straight into our sights. The team shifted to their secondary positions, ones that had never appeared in any survey, never been documented in any file. Cooper's real demolitions grid activated silently, making the obvious charges Maria had found look like amateur work in comparison. Cartels bringing in their elite units, Chen reported. Ex-Spetsnaz contractors, Mexican Special Forces veterans, real professionals. Good, Frank replied quietly. Professionals will understand what happens next, might even survive because of it. The sun climbed higher as the cartel forces continued their preparations, each move based on Maria's detailed intelligence. They thought they were being brilliant, exploiting documented weaknesses. Instead, they were positioning themselves perfectly for what was to come. Remember Tehran? Sullivan asked over comms. How we let them think they'd compromised our entire operation. then showed them what a real compromise felt like. Cooper finished, checking his detonators. This is better. They're not just walking into a trap. They're enthusiastically diving in. Frank watched Vargas personally directing units through his binoculars, noting how the cartel commander was positioning his forces with absolute confidence. Maria's intelligence had convinced them they'd found every secret, understood every defense. "Sir," Sarah's voice came through secure channels. "Maria's accessing more files, sending them detailed layouts of the farm's infrastructure." "Let her," Frank ordered. "Every file she sends makes our job easier. By the time they realize those plans were meant to be found, it'll be too late." The team continued their preparations, each man working with the fluid precision that came from decades of experience. Every adjustment they made was invisible. Every real defensive position remained undetected. They weren't just changing tactics. They were revealing why some operators were too dangerous to infiltrate. Cartel's starting final preparations. Ramirez reported, "Vargas is telling his men they've found our weakness, promising them an easy victory." "Perfect," Frank replied, watching another cartel unit move exactly where he wanted them. "Let them think they've outsmarted us. Let them believe they've uncovered all our secrets." As evening approached, the trap was nearly complete. Every cartel unit had positioned itself based on Maria's intelligence, each commander confident they'd found the key to breaking the farm's defenses. They thought they were about to spring a brilliant ambush. "Almost seems unfair," Cooper mused, watching the enemy forces settle into their positions. "They wanted to play at espionage," Frank replied, his voice carrying the weight of countless classified operations. "Now they'll learn why some missions never made the official records, why some secrets are meant to be discovered and others—" He smiled coldly. "Others are best left buried." The Texas sun set on what the cartel thought was their moment of triumph. Tomorrow they would learn the difference between finding a secret and understanding it, between compromising a defense and comprehending it, between infiltrating old soldiers and surviving the experience. The night before battle carried an electricity Frank remembered from decades past, that familiar tension in the air, the calm before chaos erupted. His team moved through their final preparations with practiced efficiency, each man checking and rechecking equipment that had waited years for this moment. Cartels finished their deployment, Ramirez reported from his surveillance center. 87 vehicles, over 200 personnel. They've committed everything they have in 3 states to this operation. Frank studied Chen's tactical display, watching the enemy units settle into their positions. Every placement followed Maria's intelligence perfectly, each commander confident they'd found the ideal approach to breach the farm's defenses. There, using her survey maps to sight their artillery, O'Brien observed from his hidden position, setting up interlocking fields of fire exactly where we wanted them. Cooper emerged from his final inspection rounds, his eyes carrying that focused gleam Frank remembered from darker days. "Primary charges are ready. Secondary grid is active but invisible. Third layer surprises are primed. Just like Malaysia, but with 50 years of refinement." Sarah's intelligence network provided constant updates. Local farmers reported cartel forces conducting final equipment checks, bringing in additional heavy weapons, establishing command and control centers. Every move they made followed Maria's documented intelligence about the farm's supposed vulnerabilities. "Vargas is addressing his officers," Ramirez intercepted, "telling them victory is certain, that they've found every weakness, mapped every defense, that tomorrow they'll teach some old men the price of defiance." "Remember Panama?" Sullivan asked. "Overcomes. How confident they were right before we showed them what a real operation looked like." Frank moved through his property one final time, Rex padding silently beside him. To any observer, they were just an old man and his dog making evening rounds. But his practiced eye caught every detail. each piece of equipment precisely placed, each seeming vulnerability carefully crafted to conceal deadly purpose. Final numbers, Chen reported, updating tactical displays. 3 mechanized assault groups, 2 professional infantry units, specialized breach teams, air support and artillery, plus their regular cartel forces. All positioned exactly according to Maria's intelligence, Cooper added with grim satisfaction, following her maps right into our real killing grounds. The team gathered in Frank's kitchen for a final briefing. Coffee brewed as Chen laid out tomorrow's predicted battle flow, showing how each enemy move, based on the compromised intelligence, would lead them deeper into prepared positions they'd never documented. Like Jakarta, O'Brien reminisced. But this time we're not improvising. This time we've had decades to plan every detail, layer every deception. Sarah arrived with last-minute updates. Police bands are quiet, too quiet. Sheriff Thompson's pulled all patrols from the area. State police have suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Everyone who needs to be gone is gone. And Maria? Frank asked quietly, still at her office, still feeding them information. She's convinced she's giving them everything they need to win. Frank nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. The infiltrator's greatest victory was about to become the cartel's costliest mistake. Every file she sent, every weakness she revealed, only confirmed their confidence in compromised intelligence. Remember Bogota? Sullivan's voice carried over comms. How we let them think they knew all our capabilities. Then showed them what real capabilities looked like. Cooper finished. This is better. We're not just letting them think they know. Our plans, we're making them believe they've outsmarted us. The night deepened as final preparations concluded. Each team member moved to their real positions, ones that had never appeared in any survey, never been documented in any file. The cartel thought they were setting up for a brilliant assault. Instead, they were arranging themselves perfectly for what was to come. Dawn's coming, Chen observed, checking his watch. They'll move at first light, thinking they have surprise. Let them come, Frank replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm his team remembered from countless classified operations. Time to remind them why some missions never made official records, why some operators were too dangerous to document. The Texas night settled over the farm, stars wheeling overhead. To any observer, it looked peaceful. Just another quiet evening on an old man's property. But beneath that tranquil surface, decades of preparation were about to reveal why some secrets are best left undiscovered, and why threatening old soldiers is a mistake you only make once. First light brought the unmistakable sound of helicopters. 3 cartel gunships approaching from different directions. Frank watched them through his thermal optics, noting their professional formation. They were running dark, using night vision, confident they had surprise. Just like old times, Cooper whispered over comms. Remember Quito? How they thought air superiority would make the difference. Target positions confirmed, O'Brien reported from his hidden nest. All 3 gunships exactly where we predicted. Following Maria's suggested approach vectors perfectly, the morning twilight revealed the full scale of what was coming. Cartel ground forces were moving into their final positions, heavy weapons being zeroed, assault teams conducting last-minute equipment checks, everything based on their infiltrators' intelligence. Vargas is deploying his elite units, Ramirez. Intercepted. Ex-military contractors in the lead, regular cartel forces providing support. They're using Maria's maps to coordinate the entire assault. Sarah's morning update painted the bigger picture. Local police scanners are dead silent. State police channels too. Someone's made sure we won't have any official interference. Frank watched enemy forces position themselves exactly where his team had spent decades preparing for them to be. Each commander confident, each unit sure they knew what they faced. The morning mist concealed just how wrong they were. Remember, Bogota? Sullivan's voice carried quiet amusement. How they brought in every professional soldier they could hire. Then learned why professionals fear ghosts, Chen finished, monitoring tactical displays. This is better. They think they have complete intelligence, think they know exactly what they're facing. The cartel's preparations were impressive. Specialized breach teams with military-grade equipment, electronic warfare units to suppress, communications, even combat engineers to handle documented defensive measures. They'd planned for everything Maria had shown them. Final count, Ramirez reported. 3 mechanized assault groups, 4 professional infantry units, specialized support teams, plus air assets and artillery, over 300 combat personnel total. All their eggs in one basket, Cooper observed, checking his real defensive grid one last time. Everything they have committed to one operation. Frank's secure phone buzzed, a message from Sheriff Thompson. Whatever's about to happen, just remember she's still my sister. Understood, Frank replied simply. Some debts had to be paid, but there were always choices in how to collect. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist. To any observer, the farm looked peaceful, just an old man's property waiting to start another day. The cartel forces thought they were hidden, their positions secret, their approach concealed. Time check, Chen announced. 30 minutes to predicted assault start. All units in position, according to Maria's intelligence. Frank made one final circuit of his property, Rex alert beside him. Every piece of equipment was exactly where it should be, every system primed, every trap ready. Decades of preparation were about to bear fruit. "Remember what you taught me about patience?" Sarah asked over comms. "About waiting for the perfect moment?" "Some lessons you only learn with age," Frank replied, watching cartel forces make their final adjustments. Like why certain operations never made official records, why some victories had to stay secret. The team settled into their real positions, ones that had never been surveyed, never been documented, never been compromised. The cartel thought they had complete intelligence, thought they knew every secret, understood every defense. Almost. "Time," Cooper reported, his voice carrying that professional edge they all remembered. "They're starting their final communications checks." Frank took his position, feeling that familiar calm settle over him. The calm that came from knowing every detail had been planned, every contingency prepared for, every apparent weakness crafted. To become a strength. "Remember what we used to say before the darkest missions?" Sullivan asked over their secured channel. "About why some soldiers are best left in retirement." The team finished together, each man checking his equipment. On final time, the Texas sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. But for the cartel forces preparing their assault, a different kind of heat was coming. The kind that left no evidence, no witnesses, and no official explanation. "Dawn of another beautiful day," Frank murmured to Rex, watching the enemy's final preparations through his scope. Time to remind them why some old men are best left alone. The cartel attack began precisely at dawn, exactly as Maria's intelligence suggested would be optimal. 3 gunships swept in low, using the documented approach corridors. Ground forces launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions, each unit following her carefully mapped routes. "Right on schedule," Frank observed calmly. "Cooper?" "Waiting for it," the demolitions expert replied, watching his real sensor grid. "Almost there." The lead helicopter passed over what their maps showed as safe ground. Cooper's hidden charges detonated, not explosively, but with precisely calculated electromagnetic pulses. All 3 gunships suddenly lost power, their pilots fighting to maintain control as every electronic system failed simultaneously. "Like Nicaragua," Sullivan commented, "but with better timing." The gunships managed emergency landings, their crews suddenly realizing something was very wrong, but they had no time to warn the ground forces already committed to their assault. First, wave hitting the outer perimeter, Chen reported, following Maria's infiltration routes perfectly. The cartel's elite units moved with professional precision, using documented gaps in the farm's security. They found each position exactly where their intelligence said it would be, and that was their first mistake. "Remember Malaysia?" O'Brien asked from his hidden position. "How we let them think they'd found all our defenses." Frank watched through his tactical display as the cartel forces triggered their real defensive grid. Suddenly, every route they thought was safe became a trap. Every position they thought was vulnerable became a killing zone. "Now," Frank commanded quietly. The farm's irrigation system activated, not with water, but with a chemical compound Cooper had spent decades perfecting. Non-lethal, but devastating to night vision equipment, thermal imaging, and electronic sensors. The cartel's technological advantage vanished in seconds. "Second wave committed," Ramirez reported. "They're following their assault plan, pushing harder to support the first wave." "Perfect," Frank replied. "Chen." The tactical officer activated their real communications network. Suddenly, every cartel radio frequency was compromised. Units received conflicting orders. Supporting elements got false coordinates. The carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos. "Like Tehran," Sullivan observed. "But this time we control every variable." Vargas's voice cut through the confusion, ordering his forces to continue the attack. The cartel commanders pushed forward still, confident in Maria's intelligence, still certain they understood the farm's defenses. "They're approaching the barn kill zone," Cooper announced. "Primary charges armed." Frank watched the elite units advance, their movements still professional despite the growing chaos. "Wait for it. Let them commit fully." The cartel forces reached what they thought was a vulnerable approach to the farm's center. Their maps showed clear fields of fire, documented defensive weaknesses. Instead, they found themselves in the most sophisticated ambush zone ever created. "Now!" Frank ordered. Cooper's real demolitions grid activated, not with explosions but with precisely calculated terrain manipulation. Escape routes disappeared. Support positions became traps. Every fallback option led to prepared kill zones. "Third wave launching," Chen reported. "They're committing everything, just like Seoul," O'Brien commented, "when they thought numbers would make the difference." Frank watched the cartel forces push deeper into his defensive network. Each move they made based on Maria's intelligence led them further into prepared positions they never knew existed. "Remember what we learned in Bogota?" Sullivan asked as the trap closed. "About the difference between finding a weakness and understanding it." The team finished together. The morning sun revealed the full scope of what was happening. The cartel's massive assault force, their professional soldiers, their advanced equipment. All of it was being systematically neutralized by defenses they never knew to look for. "Like the old days," Cooper observed, watching his sensors track enemy movement. "Better," Frank corrected, as another cartel unit moved exactly where he wanted them. "In the old days, we had to improvise. This time, we've had 50 years to perfect every detail." The battle was far from over, but its outcome was already certain. The cartel was about to learn why some missions never made official records, why some operators were too dangerous to document, and why threatening old soldiers is a mistake you only make once. The Texas sun climbed higher over a battlefield that defied explanation. 300 of the cartel's best fighters, their elite units and professional soldiers, found themselves caught in a trap 50 years in the making. Every move they made, based on Maria's intelligence, led them deeper into prepared positions they never knew existed. "They're starting to understand," Ramirez reported, monitoring their increasingly frantic communications. "Vargas is realizing Maria's intelligence wasn't a breakthrough. It was bait." Frank watched through his tactical display as the cartel forces tried to adapt. Their training showed as they attempted to regroup, to find new approaches, to counter defenses they couldn't see, but every alternative they found had been prepared for decades ago. "Like Caracas," Sullivan observed, "when they thought changing Tactics would save them. The cartel's professional soldiers tried to establish new defensive positions. Instead, they found Cooper's third-layer surprises, hidden engineering that could transform solid ground into impassable terrain at the touch of a button. Their heavy weapons became useless, their vehicles trapped. "They're trying to call in reinforcements," Chen reported, "but Ramirez's electronic warfare grid has isolated them completely. No communications getting in or out." Vargas's voice crackled. Over their monitored frequencies, rage mixing with growing fear. "Who are these people? What are we dealing with?" "Now they're asking the right questions," O'Brien commented from his position. "Bit late, though." Frank watched the cartel commander attempt to rally his forces for one final push. Vargas was good, gathering his remaining professional units, coordinating their movements despite the communications blackout, trying to turn defeat into victory. "Like Singapore," Cooper said, "when they thought desperation would overcome planning." "Time to end this," Frank decided. "Execute Operation Twilight." The team moved with practiced precision, activating systems that had waited decades for this moment. Suddenly, every piece of farm equipment became part of a coordinated defensive network. Irrigation systems, power lines, even the grain silos. All revealed hidden purposes that transformed the battlefield. "Remember what we learned in Cairo?" Sullivan asked as the trap closed. "About the difference between winning a battle and making sure it stays won," the team finished together. The cartel forces found themselves facing not just defeat, but complete dismantlement. Every escape route led to capture. Every resistance point became untenable. Their options weren't just limited. They were being systematically eliminated. "Vargas is calling for surrender," Ramirez intercepted. "His professional units are laying down weapons. The regular cartel forces are abandoning vehicles, trying to run." "Sarah!" Frank called over secure comms. "Time for Phase 2!" His granddaughter activated her network. State police units that had been quietly positioned hours ago moved in to intercept fleeing cartel members. FBI teams appeared as if by magic. Having waited for exactly this moment, every escape route led straight to waiting law enforcement, like Panama, Chen observed. "But this time, we controlled both the battle and the aftermath." Frank watched through his tactical display as the operation reached its conclusion. 300 of the cartel's best fighters caught in a trap they never saw coming, their defeat, engineered by old men they'd underestimated. "Maria's at the sheriff's office," Sarah reported, "trying to delete files, erase evidence." "Let her," Frank replied calmly. "Everything she's erasing was meant to be found. The real records, the ones that matter, those were never written down." The morning sun revealed the full scope of what had happened. The cartel's massive assault force had been defeated not by violence, but by preparation. Not by direct confrontation, but by decades of careful planning. Every piece of intelligence they thought would give them victory had instead guaranteed their defeat. "Clean-up time," Cooper announced, beginning the process of returning the farm to its innocent appearance. Soon, there would be no evidence of what had happened here. No proof of the sophisticated systems that had turned an old man's property into a masterpiece of tactical engineering. "Like the old days," Sullivan observed as they watched law enforcement process captured cartel forces. "Better," Frank corrected, surveying his unchanged farm. "In the old days, we had to leave evidence. This time, we made sure some victories stay unrecorded." The Texas morning blazed bright and clear, promising another ordinary day. But the cartel had learned why some old soldiers are best left alone, why some missions never made official records, and why threatening the wrong farmer can be the last mistake you ever make. A week after the battle, Frank sat on his porch watching the sunrise, Rex at his feet. The farm looked exactly as it had before, every trace of the confrontation erased, every sophisticated system hidden once again beneath its innocent exterior. "Just got word," Sarah announced, bringing his morning coffee. Cartels pulling out of 3 states, their entire regional operations collapsing. Seems nobody wants to risk running into ghost soldiers who can defeat armies without firing a shot. Frank nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. The story had spread through criminal circles, growing with each telling. Tales of invisible defenders, of unstoppable forces, of old men who could defeat armies using nothing but farming equipment. "Maria?" he asked quietly. "Witness protection," Sarah replied. "Sheriff Thompson made a deal, full cooperation in exchange for her safety. She's helping dismantle cartel operations across 6 states. His team had dispersed as quietly as they'd arrived. Cooper back to his pest control business, Ramirez to his communications work, Chen to his consulting, O'Brien and Sullivan vanishing like the ghosts they'd always been. But Frank knew they were still watching, still ready if needed. "Some stories are better as mysteries," he told Sarah, watching another peaceful Texas dawn. "Let them wonder how we did it. Let them guess what other old soldiers might be out there, waiting." The farm would continue, growing crops and raising cattle, but it had become something else too, a warning to those who thought old men were easy targets, who believed age meant weakness. A reminder that some victories are best left unexplained, and some soldiers are best left in retirement. "Like you always taught me," Sarah said, understanding at last. "Sometimes the best defense isn't what people can see, but what they'll never know to look for," Frank finished, as Rex alert beside him, guarding a piece bought with 50 years of preparation and one perfect operation that would never make the official records.